objective with our ultimate compact gaming build guide was to build an extremely powerful, basically as good as it gets gaming rig within the confines of an extremely small chassis. We wanted to have the option to overclock this beast, we wanted to maintain acceptable thermals, and we wanted to have it not be too loud. This truly is a have your cake and eat it too machine. As usual, we're going to start with the rationale behind each of the components, why we chose that particular part, and some of the other considerations that you may want to think about if you're going to undergo a similar project. And then after that, we're going to show you guys the actual process of building the machine with nice close-ups of what we're doing so you can follow along. And then finally, we are going to show off the finished machine, including some performance numbers, which I think you are going to find to be quite impressive. Before we begin though, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor. Thank you Intel for making this build guide possible. We can't do these videos without the support of great companies like Intel. They're the ones who are actually providing us the budget to set aside a week to plan, shoot, and edit this video. So they're awesome guys over there. Huge thanks again to Intel for making this happen. Now, when you cram a lot of components into a very small enclosure, the biggest considerations are usually the actual physical size constraints and keeping thermals at acceptable and safe levels. For that reason, part selection is absolutely critical. When the individual components in your system run too hot, you are left with basically two undesirable options. So number one is you can just leave them to their own devices and their automatic fan control algorithms, especially graphics cards, will just ramp up fan speeds to uncomfortable levels, which I personally find quite offensive, although it might not matter to you if you're a headphone user, so your mileage may vary on that one. And then option number two is that the components will simply run too hot, which can cause reliability problems in both the short and in the long term. Now we're going to walk you through each of the parts in the system one by one to give you an idea of why we chose it and to give you some tips and pointers for how to choose your own, whether you are using a small case like this or if you're just building a regular non-compact gaming machine. Because remember guys, it's not always all about size, right? The Intel Core i7 4770K with a Be Quiet Shadow Rock 2 cooler was our weapon of choice for this machine. Now, particularly before overclocking, Intel's 4th gen Core series processors offer unbeatable performance per watt, so that's the heat output, which is necessary for what we're trying to achieve here. Now, you could make the argument that there's another 4th gen processor, the 4670K, that would be very, very suitable for this build, but we opted for the 4770K with hyperthreading just because we're kind of going for ultimate here, and while most games right now are not going to benefit from the additional threads, that improvement in the coding of games is definitely coming, and there are many gamers who also do other things with their machines, such as video editing or other heavily threaded workloads. When it came to the memory, we actually didn't go full-on ultimate here. More RAM and higher memory speed each deliver very limited performance improvements in games, so I mean, right now it looks like in Battlefield 4 there's some benefit to faster memory, but that's a bit of an isolated case. So we decided to go with something pretty standard. We went with a 16 gig dual channel kit of 2133 megahertz memory from ADATA. We could have gone all out like 2400 megahertz or 3000 megahertz or whatever else the case may be, but the reason we went with this option is that when you go 2133, you're actually not paying much more than a 1600 megahertz kit. So really that's the reason why, just because it wasn't costing us more. Once you go past that, it starts to get more expensive. The reason we went with 16 gigs is because it gives us more than enough for now with the option to upgrade in the future without totally overspending on the memory in comparison to the rest of the system. 16 gigs also gives us a little bit of flexibility for more memory intensive applications like the video editing we mentioned before. Micro ATX performance motherboards often actually deliver a pretty compelling value compared to their ATX counterparts, even if you were to use them in a full-size case and not an MATX case. But anyway, we went with the G1 Sniper M5 from Gigabyte because its optimal PCI Express slot spacing allows us to actually install 2 dual slot graphics cards running at PCIe 8X Gen 3, which is more than enough bandwidth even for 780 Ti's, and have a leftover PCIe 4X slot for an additional add-in card of our choice down the road, whatever we want to put in it. That's not bad for MATX. Not to mention it comes with all the latest bells and whistles, including swappable op amps for the onboard audio, well, one swappable op amp, killer networking, overclocking options galore, and all of that at under $200. The green color scheme will also go very nicely with our green graphics cards and green LED lighting effects, but of course, I'm not that shallow, so the color had nothing to do with it. It was all about the technological superiority. I like green. For the case, we went with the BitFenix Phenom M. It uses the same internals as the Prodigy M, and while it doesn't have the same hardcore water cooling and hard drive mounting options as the ITX version does, it still has room for a large air cooling heatsink for the CPU, and the added expansion for PCI Express cards is awesome. It features 5 PCI slots at the back for future expansion, which is a huge benefit if you ever wanted to, say, for example, add dual graphics cards or something like that. It's also small enough to easily pack this SLI rig around with you to LAN parties or wherever else you might need to take an immensely powerful, well-cooled little rig. Speaking of cooling, it can accept plenty of cooling fans, which we can run at low RPMs when we're idling for quiet operation, then ramp up as needed. We'll be using Spectre Pro green LED fans for this machine. Spectre Pros are one of the only really good-looking fans out there that also have performance and quiet operation on their side. So there are a couple of other exceptions, but for the most part, you gotta choose performance or looks. Well, we chose both. Once again, guys, storage is so personal, but we're gonna go with something pretty standard for this one, which should be applicable to many different people. An Intel 530 series 240 gig SSD will act as our OS and key applications / games drive, while a Western Digital 4TB black will be our storage powerhouse to handle a massive Steam library, a media collection, and all that kind of stuff, and still provide excellent performance, but with huge storage. This SSD plus hard drive configuration has grown in popularity over the last couple of years a lot, and I think we're probably going to be sticking with it for quite a while for most high-performance users. I mean, until something paradigm-shifting happens with respect to SSD pricing and capacity, or maybe some other new technology comes along, it makes a ton of sense to go with fast, small storage, and then slower, massive storage, so you get the best of both worlds. Well, guys, for us, there was really only one ultimate gaming graphics card configuration. We've gone with 2 GTX 780 Ti graphics cards from EVGA. I really don't know what to say about these other than that they're the fastest gaming cards on the market, and their thermal and acoustic performance made them an obvious choice over the Red Team this time around for this specific build because of the constraints we have in terms of space. We went with rear exhaust cards versus an open cooler like EVGA's ACX cooler because we felt we would rather compromise GPU temperatures a little bit. We'll have the GPU running a little bit hotter for the sake of keeping the rest of the inside of the case cooler. Remember that not every component in your system can be read with a temperature monitor, so for things like your power delivery components on the motherboard, lower ambient temperatures inside the system can make a big difference to long-term reliability. So just because you have a couple graphics cards in there and your CPU temps look okay and your GPU temps look okay, that doesn't mean that an open air cooler is necessarily the best choice for you. So rear exhaust for very small builds is definitely recommended. Peripheral-wise for this rig, honestly guys, I'm not sure how much sense it makes to keep including these since everyone's choices will be so different, but tell you what, let me know if you'd like me to keep featuring peripherals that I think make sense for each build, and we'll see if we keep doing it in the future. Anyway, we just got our hands on the Ducky Shine 3, so for our all-out machine, we are suggesting this all-out keyboard. Unfortunately, ours are blue backlight, so they won't match the rest of the green theme here, but don't worry, there's a green one available, and it's available in all the main Cherry MX key switch types and in either a 104 4-key layout or a 10-keyless layout, so you can get something to match your rig for sure. For our mouse, we are going with the DeathAdder 2013. Again, it's green to match our build, which isn't the main factor here, because the main factor here is the fact that it features one of the best sensors on the market, as well as excellent ergonomics. This is an extremely well-regarded mouse out there right now, and I have already recommended it in previous build guides, but I have no problem recommending it again. Finally, for our monitor, it's kind of big, gotta go get it. We've gone with the BenQ XL2420Ti. If you saw my unboxing, you'll already know that for a 144 Hz monitor, it is far and away the best looking one we've ever seen in terms of color and viewing angle. The one caveat is that it doesn't support G-Sync. So yeah, until monitors that support G-Sync start arriving, I don't know that I can recommend investing in a gaming monitor right now, but if I absolutely had to, then that would be the one. Which leads us finally to our operating system. We went with Windows 8 because that's all you can really get right now for gaming. Maybe at some point here, SteamOS is going to be an option, but that is still very much in beta right now. In fact, we have it running upstairs, very much in beta, not ready yet. Windows 8 for this particular machine. When it comes to pre-build safety and setup, basically what you want is to start with a safe, static-free workstation and anti-static strap. I like to keep mine on my ankle to keep it out of the way. You also want to make sure there's no unnecessary clutter around so that you can lose screws or trip on something and knock something over, because that would be disastrous. Next up, all we really need for assembly these days is a multi-bit screwdriver, and the last thing is I always recommend doing your first build and powering it up outside the case to ensure that everything works while it's nice and easy to reach in case something goes wrong and you have to take it back to the store or send it back to the manufacturer. The motherboard box makes a very handy non-conductive test bench for this outside the case installation. We'll start with CPU installation. After carefully removing the CPU from the package, align the little golden triangle on the corner of the CPU with the triangle on the plastic cover. Then what you're going to do is lift the retention arm by pushing away, then up without removing the plastic cover that protects the delicate pins inside the socket. Just leave that in place for now. Then what we're going to do is gently place the CPU in the socket. The risk of damage to your system is highest at this point in the build process, so be extremely careful. If you're forcing it, then there is definitely a problem. Once the CPU is in place, pull down the retention cover, then pull down the retention arm, lift it out away a little bit, and then lock it under that little clamp right there. Once you've done that, there it goes, the plastic cover will pop itself right off. Put that in the motherboard box for safekeeping. If you ever need to return your motherboard, they will require you to send it in with this cover, because once again, those pins inside that socket are extremely fragile. DDR3 installation is simple. Pull back the tabs on your motherboard, align the notches on your memory with the notches inside the sockets, then insert it gently, and finally press firmly down on the memory on both sides until the latch clicks back into place on its own. Then you're done. Always install matched memory sticks in the color-matched slots on modern motherboards for dual-channel operation. This gives you better performance. When it comes to heatsink installation, everyone is a little bit different, and Be Quiet's mounting systems are not always my favorite, but they do have solidly built products at good prices, so that's why we went for it in this particular case, because it's going to fit quite well with the rest of our hardware, but still give us maximum cooling on the CPU. So don't be intimidated by all the little tiny bits and screws and pieces right here. We're going to show you how exactly it all goes together on the board. So we start with the backplate. You position the backplate so that the screws on the back of the little backplate that's already on the motherboard poke through the much bigger backplate. Then you're going to take each of these 4 longer screws and put them through the board so that we can access them on the top. The next step is to take the little plastic washers and clip them from the top so that they stay in place and don't fall back through the board. So now they're going through the backplate and they are stuck in place. Now that the backplate is securely in place, we can thread on the nuts that will support the CPU hold down. Use the included wrench to hold them in place from the front of the board while tightening them from the back of the board with a Phillips head screwdriver. Now we're done with our board for a little bit and it's time to work on the heatsink itself. Simply use the 4 countersunk screws to attach the hold downs to the bottom of the heatsink. That's how we're actually going to, well, hold it down onto the CPU. Now this next step is optional, but to maintain the awesome looks of this system, we are going to swap out the stock fan, which is actually a very good fan, with a Spectre Pro. Just remove the metal clips on the stock fan and then put them back onto the new fan exactly the same way. It's actually quite simple. And now it's looking good. Aw, yeah. Next up, put a line of thermal compound, which is included with your heatsink, onto the CPU, and then position the heatsink with a sensible fan orientation. So we're going for kind of a pseudo push-pull configuration. So once the motherboard's in the case, the rear exhaust will actually help the fan that we installed as a push fan pull air through that massive heatsink. Also, don't forget to orient the fan when you're installing it so that the power lead reaches to the CPU fan header without any extra cable mess, lying around all over the place. Solid cable management starts at every step, making sure that you're maintaining it. So you can actually plug that in now. We're ready for that. I think at this point, you'll start to see why we went with a low profile memory kit from ADATA for this build. Tall memory modules can interfere with large CPU heatsinks in some cases. Get it? In cases they can interfere because this is a computer and we're gonna put it in a case and, oh man, I cracked myself up. Okay, no, but seriously, we actually aren't quite done with this yet. We'll use that wrench again from the front and then the screwdriver again from the back, but this time we are tightening nuts onto the top of the hold down. Again, this isn't my favorite CPU mounting mechanism in the world, but the good news is that once they're all on there, it is extremely solid and it's not going anywhere. Now, my friends, it is time to start working on the case. So we're going to begin by taking off both side panels by removing the 4 thumb screws at the back. What I really recommend doing is taking these side panels and putting them back into the case box for now because we won't need them until a bit later. The Phenom M is a little bit different from most cases though in that we will need it at some point during the assembly process here because you can see that the front I/O is actually located on one of the side panels where we have our power and reset buttons as well as our front audio ports and our USB 3 ports. One little trick for this case as well that we're going to actually do is we're going to switch sides and we're going to put the side panel with the I/O on the left-hand side of the case, and we're going to take this side panel and move it over to the other side. I found that when I was working on this case recently that it was a little bit easier to do cable management that way, and the only drawback is that the logo on your power and reset buttons will be upside down in the finished product. Now that the case is open, undo the twist tie that's holding the accessory box in place. That box contains all the screws you need to assemble your system, so please don't lose it. And for that matter, don't lose that twist tie. Twist ties are a handy-dandy, reusable way of doing cable management later on. You can even cut them to size according to what you need if you have nice long ones like this. Next, you'll need to remove the brace that's across the side panel. Just take out the 4 countersunk screws and pull that out and put it somewhere safe. Make sure you also put those screws somewhere safe. I recommend the accessory box that already contains all of your other screws. Now it is time to replace all the fans that came with your case if you want to. The ones that come with it are decent, but we're throwing in Spectre Pro, so yeah. It'll be much more difficult to try and do this later, so make sure you do fans pretty much first. We'll start at the bottom by removing the air shield that comes on the case. I don't plan to reinstall this because we're going to need that airflow space. Next, we'll remove the 4 screws that are holding in the bottom fan. Take off the stock fan, and then we're going to reuse those screws to replace it with our Spectre Pro. I also changed the orientation to turn this one into an intake to bring fresh air to both my CPU heatsink and also up to my graphics cards. We then repeat that same procedure for the rear fan, replacing it this time with a 140mm Spectre Pro just to get a little bit more airflow. Just a reminder here, guys, make sure you're checking your fan orientations as you're installing each of them. It's nice to have logos the right side up up in the finished build, but it's even nicer to have short, easy to manage runs to the fan headers on your motherboard once everything's installed. Now, we would have liked to install more fans in the top of this case. Two 120mm fans up there would have been absolutely perfect for fresh air for those graphics cards, but unfortunately, the fans don't quite fit between the metal of our chassis and the plastic outer layer. And when given the choice between a board with tight spacing between the graphics cards, which would cause one of the cards to be starved for airflow, but it allow top fans to be installed for even better airflow to the other card, and then going with this board, which offers much better graphics card spacing, but doesn't allow for those top fans to be installed on the other side, I think that was a sacrifice we were willing to make. Not to mention, of course, having the graphics card spaced out like that gives us future expansion and the ability to install another PCI Express card here. Power supply installation starts by taking out the thumb screw that holds in the power supply bracket here at the front of the case. The holes on this bracket do allow for the fan on the power supply to face inward towards the components or outwards towards the front of the case, where it can take in air from these little vents on the side at the front here. But the design of the case favors inward facing. For my build, however, I don't have much air intake because I wasn't able to install those top fans, so in order to keep my intake and exhaust as balanced as I can, which is optimal for cooling, I wanted to install the power supply with the fan facing towards the front of the case, so it could pull in its own fresh air, then exhaust it out the bottom of the chassis without affecting the pressure of the inside of the case, the air pressure. So I had to do a quick double check to make sure that all of my cables would reach with acceptable cable management to the places that they needed to go, and then I was ready to commit and screw the bracket into the power supply in my chosen orientation. Now, I'd like to take this opportunity to point out that the Pure Power 700 watt power supply we're using is by no means the only option for this build. In fact, it's not even really that high end for something that's like an ultimate build. I was just trying to make a point that modular power supplies like this Corsair AX860i aren't always the best option, especially when you're planning to use all of the connected cables anyway, because modular power supplies tend to be larger to accommodate that modular interface. So as long as we can manage the cables or use them all, we're not really getting any benefit out of the modular interface. The other point I was trying to make is about the power efficiency of the components we're using. This 700 watt power supply will handle it. I'll show you guys that at the end of the video, but with all that said, it's only an 80+ bronze power supply and all that, so an AX860i or something similar would also be a great choice for this particular build. I guess the other thing is, whoops, excuse me, we always use modular power supplies, so I'm shaking things up a little bit. Anyway, to finish up the power supply installation, we align the little notches on the bracket, slide the power supply now connected to the bracket back in, put the thumb screw back in place, and then flip the case over so that we can plug in the pass-through cable that allows the power supply to be installed in the front of the case. It's a little bit tricky, it's a little bit of a tight fit, but we managed to get it in there. Now is also a good time to flip that power supply switch to the on position if it has one, to save yourself some headache later. When you finish the build, press the power button on the front of the system and it doesn't turn on and you're like, oh, what's wrong with it? And it was just the power button on the bottom of the power supply, but you didn't think of it because it's on the bottom of this case. So before putting in the motherboard, there are a few things that we're going to need from the motherboard box. Grab your I/O shield, your SLI bridge, and your SATA cables. We'll need the I/O shield now, but the other two you can put aside for later. Installing the I/O shield is a little bit tricky in this case. Remember that the motherboard is 180 degrees off the normal upright orientation, so your I/O shield will go in upside down compared to normal. Make sure you get that right at this stage. Next, find the motherboard standoffs in your box of case screws. They look a little something like this. Then, grab the little included tool that adapts your Phillips head screwdriver to a standoff socket. There are 4 standoffs already installed, but you'll need to use that little tool to install 4 additional ones, here, 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 and here. Now guys, you can see that our power supply is actually already in from our test fit, but don't worry, we're going to show you the whole installation process in just a moment. In really small cases like this, it can be handy to pre-connect some of the cables to your motherboard before actually lowering the motherboard into the case. Particularly the 8-pin CPU connector is going to be hard to reach with that large CPU heatsink nearby. So we pre-connected the 8-pin and the 24-pin ATX connector. It's important here though to note that we aren't able to fully install the power supply until after the motherboard is screwed in place due to space constraints, particularly with that large heatsink. Screwing in the motherboard is pretty easy, but make sure guys that you're using a long enough screwdriver, and I would highly recommend using a magnetic one. So just put the 8 screws into the 8 different places where they go, and again, please use a magnetic screwdriver because otherwise screws can fall into little nooks and crannies in the case where they're extremely difficult to retrieve. A magnetic screwdriver will not damage your components. The magnets are not nearly strong enough. We'll take this chance now to put our power supply back in, but don't worry guys, the details for that are coming in a second, so don't mind the power supply, don't mind the man behind the curtain. And now is also a good time to connect our fans to the appropriate headers. We could plug them directly into the power supply, but I prefer using the onboard connectors on the motherboard to enable BIOS and software level fan control once the system is up and running. Now normally we do cable management as a finishing touch, but the way we're doing this build forces us to do it now while we can actually still get at anything. The first step is to figure out exactly which connectors we're going to need from the power supply and jam all the extra ones behind the power supply where it can be completely out of sight and out of the way of our airflow. We'll use some zip ties to keep them in place because they're so tight that I don't think twist ties will do the trick in this case. Next, we'll position the side panel with the front connectors next to the case on the left-hand side. Remember, not the side it came on. Then we'll pass all those cables through to the front. First, we'll plug in the front panel HD audio, then the front USB 3. These connectors are both keyed and or missing pins, so they'll only go in one way, just be gentle with them. And then finally, the front power and reset switches as well as the front power and drive activity LEDs. Now, BitFenix doesn't color their positive wires, which gives it a very clean look, but also makes it a little bit difficult to figure out which one's the positive wire. So you will need to match up the wire indicated in your manual, where it needs the positive one, with the tiny little arrow on the corresponding front header. So guys, look really carefully at it and make sure you get these right. In fact, at this stage, even though there's no graphics card in here, you can do a quick power on test and make sure that the LEDs illuminate, because if you get this wrong now, you'll be tearing out your graphics cards if you need to fix it in order to get at that little spot. Speaking of graphics cards, next we can tuck our PCI Express cables out of the way. We will need those soon though when we install the video cards, so just a twist tie will do the trick to make sure that, you know, they're just out of our way so we can figure out what we're doing. And then the next bit is just one way of doing this, okay? So if we were using the included cross brace with the case, we could simply install our 3.5-inch drive and our 2.5-inch SSD on here, throw that into the case, and that would work just fine. That's the way it's intended to be used. We came up with a bit of a different idea though. I wanted a cleaner look to the internals, so I had to grab a couple of longer SATA cables, and I'm going to be running them down to the bottom of the case where I'll be kind of ghetto mounting the SSD on top of the hard drive. I'll show you all that in a minute, but it's up to you which way you want to do it. One other thing I like about this approach with not having the cross brace in there is that it gives me the option to add a side panel window as like a DIY mod later on in the future. So it's totally up to you. Anyway, I grabbed those SATA cables, plug them into the motherboard. One little trick that I use is because I can never remember for stacked SATA cables, for stacked right angle SATA cable connectors, which one is 0 and which one's 1, like which is the first port, is I'll usually plug them into completely different stacks so that it's easy to figure out which one is the first one in the boot order by default in the BIOS, and I'll plug my SSD into that one so that if I ever reset my BIOS, I don't have to remember to go and manually reset my SSD as the boot device. It's just a nice little building trick for you. Anyway, once that's done, you've got pretty much everything plugged into the board, and it's time to tuck everything nicely behind that left side panel and close it up. Don't force this. If it's not closing, check what it's stuck on, readjust, and try again. Clean cable management is not worth damaging something, so just take your time and go slow. Once you do get great cable management going on though, it's very satisfying. And having the PCI Express slot area nice and tidy is great for airflow for your graphics cards and will help them run cooler and last longer. All right, so here it is, guys, the not really recommended way that I'm installing my drives into the machine. I am going to put both of them, rather than here, right down there, under the CPU heatsink. There's lots of airflow from the fans around there, but obviously there is a problem. There aren't enough mounting points for 2 drives. More on that later. Anyway, first, we're gonna mount our hard drive. These rubber grommets and screws will do nicely for that. So just put the grommets in from the bottom of the case, then position the drive in place with the SATA connectors towards the side panel. Then screw it in from the bottom. All right, so there wasn't really any trouble there. Well, no, this is where the magic starts, guys. I'm going to put my SSD right here on top of the hard drive. How, you might ask? Well, with a very famous Canadian invention, Velcro. Just put this stuff on the back of the SSD, stick it to the top of the hard drive, and you are ready to rock. Next, install the SATA power cables and SATA data cables onto both drives and then run them along the bottom of the case for better cable management. Now that we've done so much work to prepare ourselves for GPU installation, it's actually pretty straightforward. All we do is turn the case around and we find, oh, this has a toolless PCI slot mounting mechanism. So just undo the screw there, lift it up. You're gonna have to remove the PCI slot covers that are already in there because they're in the way for us to install our graphics cards. Then grab one graphics card. I'd probably recommend doing the top one first and then carefully maneuver it into the case. What you'll probably have to do is put it kind of butt end in first into the 5 1/4 inch bay that of course we can't use because our system is so full of other gear in spite of the fact that it's in there and in spite of the fact that the front of the case actually doesn't even have a spot for it. You know, that's the Phenom M for you anyway. So you go ahead and put that in and then press it down firmly. Then follow up with the second card, pressing it down firmly, then go around to the back, put that last PCI cover in unless you have another expansion card such as a sound card or RAID card or, you know, I don't know, like a Red Rocket card or whatever you want to do with this awesome little machine that is aside from putting in additional slot covers. Put the screw back in place and then just plug those bad boys in. Since you put the PCI Express power cables exactly where you were going to need them earlier on in the build, they're right there. So one 8-pin and one 6-pin connector for each of the graphics cards, and we are pretty much done here, folks. Okay, well, we're not quite done. We're finished the hardware, which brings us to software. Number one is in a system with 2 drives, I've seen Windows do this stupid thing enough times that I recommend physically unplugging the drive you don't want any of your Windows files on. So go ahead and unplug the hard drive. From time to time, it stores the boot manager on one drive and then the actual OS on the other drive, so the system can't boot without both of them in, which is ridiculous. So that's just one little tip for you guys. Then when we get into the BIOS, there's a couple little configuration tips that are just basic stuff, like not overclocking or anything like that. So just make sure that AHCI mode is enabled for all of your SATA ports and ensure that all of the components are detected correctly, your memory is running at the correct speed, and all of that good stuff. Next up, Windows installation is a snap if you know how. Don't worry about the lack of a disk drive in this machine. You can just grab all of the files off of a disk, copy them to a blank USB drive, and boot from that. It's faster and more convenient. In fact, most of the techies I know just have a dedicated USB drive for doing OS installations just like that. Drivers are the next thing, and there's something that many people struggle with, but it's not too overwhelming if you break it down. Even devices that already have drivers installed, so Windows Update will grab drivers automatically for a lot of this stuff, I would recommend grabbing the latest ones directly from the manufacturer website. So you can start with Gigabyte, they make your motherboard, so they should have the latest Intel chipset drivers, LAN or network drivers, and sound drivers, but then when you're finished with that, you can just do a double check and head over to Intel's site, Bigfoot site, Realtek site, or whoever else might manufacture the actual chips on the board itself. But I mean, as a catch-all, the Gigabyte website should be fine, and then you'll also need to go to NVIDIA's website to get the latest drivers for your graphics cards. You can pick up GeForce Experience, and it'll continue to keep them up to date on its own. Now, if there's something that you're having trouble finding a driver for, here's a little trick that I use. Go to the device manager, right-click the component in question, then just go to Details and use the drop-down box to go to Hardware ID. Then Google the VEN underscore number and device underscore number string, and it will usually tell you exactly what that device is. So then you can Google that and you can find a driver for it. So now it's conclusion time, guys. I'd like to talk about a couple things. So one is some performance numbers and some temperature numbers for our system. Small systems no longer need to perform any differently from big systems. This right here has a Core i7-4770K, perfectly capable of overclocking. It also has two GTX 780 Ti's. It will perform as well as a much larger system that has that same hardware. And in terms of temperatures, honestly, considering the size of this little beast, I think you guys will be quite impressed by the numbers that we're showing you right now. This is under a gaming load, so a real world load scenario. So let's talk about an overall trend as well. Aside from this is a great performing, reasonably quiet actually. That kind of impressed me. I'm quite impressed by that. You want to go into the BIOS and configure fan control if you want to make it this quiet, but you know, even running at full speed, I think it probably won't bother most people. Anyway, very, very quiet. So aside from the performance and the quiet and the compactness, let's talk about the trend towards portability and smaller size in the industry in general. I think the Mac Pro is a very interesting comparison here. Now, this isn't as powerful as a Mac Pro, particularly one with a 12-core CPU in it. I mean, the Mac Pro is more workstation oriented. It supports quad channel memory. It's got dual workstation grade graphics cards in it as opposed to consumer grade graphics cards, although we could put workstation grade graphics cards in here, but it's also very, very, very small. On the other hand, this system is a little bit bigger. It's a very heavy hitter for its intended use, which is heavy gaming and light video editing or other content creation. And in my mind, it's much more flexible. It's much more upgradable, especially right now. This is another trend that may or may not take off, but Apple's certainly banking on it. Less internal expansion and more external expansion. I talked a lot while we were doing this build guide about why I liked this particular board for its ability to allow us to expand and put dual graphics cards in it, and then even expand further and add an additional PCI Express slot in it. Apple has not given the option at all to expand either via PCI Express or even the internal drives of the device. You can just get a bigger single PCI Express SSD, and that's pretty much all you can do. They want you to use Thunderbolt, an external expansion option, in order to get things like high throughput storage, professional grade expansion cards like capture cards or Red Rocket cards or other devices. And they want you to do all that outside the case. So you can actually get like Thunderbolt to PCI Express enclosures and things like that. And I just have to wonder a little bit if this isn't a better middle ground, because we're getting that compactness, although so it's small enough to sit next to your monitor without being so small that it's, you know, really, really tiny and impressively small, but we actually get some internal expansion. I gotta wonder if the person who wants a tiny little Mac Pro wants an octopus of Thunderbolt cables coming out of it, connected to their monitor, and then, you know, external storage box 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 as they end up needing more things. I mean, we could still put a couple more drives in this thing without even resorting to anything external whatsoever, just by putting this bracket back into the machine. So there you go, guys. This to me is a fantastic option. It's a PC. Of course, you could probably find a way to Hackintosh it if you really wanted to run OS X, and I'll be interested to see where we go from here. Now, we focused a lot throughout this build guide as well on the high-end potential of this system, how it's got 4770K and like dual 780 Ti's, and it ended up being very expensive. But I want to also talk about some recommended ways to scale back and get better bang for the buck out of it. By going with a 4670K, a single GTX 770 or 780, and a smaller SSD and hard drive, you could actually build a system quite like this, but push the price point down to the point where it really doesn't cost any more than a regular regular desktop machine and still offers great expandability for the future. So maybe it's not the kind of thing where you're gonna chuck your current PC in the garbage and go buy one of these, but next time you're shopping for a PC, whether you move it around a lot and attend LAN events, or you don't and it just sits in one place, you may want to consider a small machine. Do you need all that expansion, or is this the interesting middle ground between something like the Mac Pro and something like a full-fledged ATX desktop tower? Anyway, guys, until next time, thank you for watching this ultimate compact gaming system build guide. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it, and leave us a comment if you have any feedback on our build guides or special requests for the next one, because there will be more of these.